A young Navy SEAL trainee hung bound to a birch tree in the bright northern woods, black tape over his mouth, blood on his face, his strength fading into the cold. Not far away, the old woman who once called him grandson had vanished, carrying a secret powerful men would do anything to bury. Then a 28-year-old FBI agent and her loyal German shepherd stepped into that same forest and found what evil thought no one would see. What began as one rescue would uncover a hidden truth, a broken family, and a fight between fear and mercy. If you believe God still sends help through brave hearts and faithful animals, leave amen. The morning over White Pine Crossing looked too clean for violence. Northern light spilled across the pines in long silver bands, and the last crusts of old snow clung to the shadows like forgotten lace. The lake beyond the trees lay still and pale blue, holding the sky the way old people hold secrets, quietly, without asking to be admired. Special Agent Evelyn Shaw stepped out of the county SUV and pulled her gloves tighter, feeling the cold bite at the thin strip of skin between sleeve and wrist. At 28, Evelyn had the kind of face people often underestimated at first glance, fine-boned, steady, almost delicate, until they noticed the eyes. Her eyes were gray and observant, set beneath dark brows that seemed permanently shaped by concentration. She wore her chestnut hair tied back low at the nape of her neck, practical and neat, though a few loose strands had already escaped into the wind. She was not tall, but she carried herself with the contained balance of someone who had learned early that calm could be sharper than force. Years of watching frightened people lie and dangerous people smile had left something in her posture, an instinctive stillness, as if part of her was always listening for the thing that didn't fit. Beside her stood Deputy Ben Holloway, a local sheriff's deputy in his late 30s, broad through the shoulders and built like a man who stacked firewood for fun. His face was weathered by northern winters and bad coffee, with a sandy beard trimmed close to his jaw and eyes the faded blue of old denim. Ben was not flashy, not clever in the theatrical way some men like to be, but he had a grounded steadiness Evelyn respected. He spoke little, and when he did, it tended to matter. Today he kept one hand near his radio and the other tucked into his jacket pocket while he stared at the abandoned pickup, half buried in slush, off the service road. "No plate switched, no wallet, no prints worth much yet," he said. "Whoever left it didn't exactly panic. They had time." Ranger moved first. The 5-year-old German shepherd was all sable strength and disciplined motion, black shading over rich brown, like smoke drawn across old bronze. He was large without heaviness, lean in the way. Working dogs are lean, every line of him made for purpose. His ears stood high and alert, and his amber-brown eyes had that unnerving canine focus that made even innocent people feel briefly guilty. Ranger was not affectionate in a sloppy way. He did not bounce, did not whine, did not offer cheap charm. But he leaned slightly toward Evelyn as if their two shadows had decided long ago to travel together. He had been trained to track, to hold, to detect fear in the chemistry of a scene before most humans noticed the room had changed. Evelyn trusted him the way some people trusted prayer, quietly, repeatedly, without making a performance of it. He circled the pickup once, nose low, then froze. His body tightened so subtly another person might have missed it. Evelyn did not. The dog's head turned toward the deeper woods, away from the road, away from the easy explanation. "You got something," she murmured. Ranger gave a single sharp pull on the lead. Ben looked over. "That your serious face or his?" he asked. Evelyn didn't answer. She was already moving. They left the road and entered the pines where the sunlight broke into narrow bars between trunks. The forest floor was soft with thawing ground, patched with icy crust and wet needles. Ranger tracked hard now, drawing them past a broken branch, then a heel mark dragged sideways in the mud. Evelyn crouched once, gloved fingers brushing the edge of a scuffed depression. More than one set of boots. Weight shifted. Struggle. She felt the first cold turn in her stomach. A few yards later, they found a strip of black tape snagged on a thorn bush. Ben swore under his breath and called it in. Then they saw him. He was tied upright against a birch tree in a clearing where the light fell cruelly bright, as if morning itself had wanted a better look. Black tape covered his mouth. His wrists were bound behind the trunk with nylon cord so tight the skin above it had swollen raw. One side of his face was bruised dark along the cheekbone, and dried blood marked the edge of his hairline. Even half collapsed, he looked strong. Caleb Mercer was 25, with the rangy, hard-built frame of a young man who had taught his body to endure what life didn't ask permission to do. His dark blonde hair was cut short, military short, though it had been matted now by sweat and dirt. A stubble shadow roughened his jaw, and beneath the bruising he had the kind of open American face that might have looked almost boyish if pain had not sharpened it. His shoulders were broad, his hands scarred across the knuckles in the ordinary way of men who train hard and fix things themselves. But what struck Evelyn most was not his build. It was the fury still alive in his eyes. Not panic, not surrender. Fury. Whoever had left him here had not broken him. They had only run out of time. A crow exploded from the branches overhead, black wings slapping the frozen air so suddenly that everyone flinched, and for one strange heartbeat the whole forest seemed to stop breathing. Then movement returned all at once. Evelyn dropped to him, cutting the tape from his mouth while Ben worked at the cord. Caleb sucked in air so hard it sounded like drowning in reverse. Ranger stood close, rigid and protective, watching the tree line rather than the man. "Easy," Evelyn said, her voice low and even. "You're safe now? Can you tell me your name?" The young man swallowed twice before sound came. "Caleb," he rasped. "Caleb Mercer." His lips were cracked, his breath smelled faintly of blood and cold. Evelyn slipped her canteen cap under his mouth and let him drink a little. "Who did this?" she asked. Caleb's eyes closed for a moment, not because he was giving up, but because memory hurt. He spoke in pieces at first. A cabin, a call. Miriam? Evelyn listened, gathering fragments the way careful hands gather broken glass. Miriam Vale, he said, had called him the night before. She had sounded wrong, not confused, not senile, just pressed flat by fear. Miriam was 72 and lived alone near Alder Lake in a cedar-sided cabin that always smelled of cinnamon tea and old books. She was a small woman with soft white hair pinned in a loose knot, thin wrists, and a face lined by grief more than age. Caleb's voice changed when he spoke of her. It lost its defensive edge and became something gentler, almost embarrassed by tenderness. He told Evelyn that Miriam was not his grandmother by blood. He had grown up bouncing through foster homes and temporary placements, never staying long enough for the walls to remember him. Miriam had hired him as a teenager to shovel snow and haul wood. Then she had fed him. Then she had asked about school. Then she had kept asking, year after year, in that stubborn, ordinary way that becomes love before anyone says the word aloud. "She used to tell people I was her grandson," Caleb whispered. "Said it made the town behave better." His mouth trembled once with pain and something heavier. "She always said, if anybody asks, just tell 'em you're my grandson." Evelyn glanced at Ben, then back at Caleb. "Why did she call last night?" Caleb took a shaking breath. "Said she had something for me. Said not to come with anybody. Said she didn't want the police because they might be listening." He shut his eyes hard. "I got near the cabin. Didn't make it in. There were at least 3 of them, maybe 4. I dropped one. I know I did. Then somebody hit me from behind." His breathing turned ragged. "They kept asking what she gave me. Asked where she hid the rest." Evelyn felt the words settle into place like stones. Not random, not rage, retrieval. The ambulance arrived with its siren muted, tires crunching over frost. 2 medics moved in fast, practiced and gentle. As they lifted Caleb onto the stretcher, Ranger suddenly pulled left, nose driving toward a patch of muddy ground near the birches. Evelyn followed and found impressions. Several boots, a dragged heel, and beside a clump of thawing grass, a jagged shard of amber-colored plastic. She picked it up carefully, part of a prescription bottle. The label was torn away, but a few faded printed characters remained. Not enough to tell a story, just enough to promise one. They loaded Caleb into the ambulance. Before the doors closed, he caught Evelyn's sleeve with surprising strength. "Find her," he said. It was not a plea spoken by a child. It was the command of a man too hurt to go himself. Evelyn gave one slow nod. "I will." The ambulance rolled away between the pines, red lights flickering softly across the bright morning. Ben was speaking into his radio, already setting wheels in motion. But Ranger did not watch the departing vehicle. He stood utterly still, head turned toward the deeper forest, a low growl vibrating from his chest, like distant thunder under snow. Evelyn looked down at the broken piece of plastic in her palm, then back toward the dark trees. The ambush had been prepared, the questions had been specific, and somewhere beyond the clean beauty of the northern morning, someone had expected Caleb Mercer to disappear without ever being found. By the time Evelyn Shaw reached Miriam Vale's cabin, the sun had climbed high enough to turn the frozen edge of Alder Lake into a sheet of pale glass. The place stood at the end of a narrow gravel lane lined with white birches and dark pines, quiet in the way old homes often are, as if they have learned not to beg the world for kindness. The cabin itself was small and cedar-sided, weathered to a soft gray-brown by years of snow and rain. Its front porch held a faded green rocking chair, a pair of muddy rubber boots, and 3 clay pots where brave little flowers had begun to rise from cold soil. Everything about it suggested routine, modesty, and a woman who still believed in wiping down her porch rail even when no one was coming. Evelyn paused at the steps and felt the ache of contrast. Violence always looked uglier against places that had tried to stay gentle. Deputy Ben Holloway came up behind her, his boots crunching lightly over old frost. He had taken off his hat, maybe out of habit, maybe out of respect. "Looks like she left in a hurry," he said. "Or somebody made the choice for her." Evelyn did not answer. Ranger already had his nose low, moving in short, deliberate patterns along the porch boards. The dog's body held a contained tension now, not panic, not excitement, a working focus that made him seem more like a question being asked of the earth. His claws clicked once against the wood, and then he stopped at the door, ears forward, nostrils flaring. The front lock was untouched. That was the first thing Evelyn noticed. The second was the back door, visible through the side window, hanging a fraction wrong in its frame. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cinnamon, old paper, and the sharp draft of coal that enters after strangers do. The kitchen was neat, but not natural. A ceramic mug sat on the table beside a plate with half a slice of toast gone stiff. A pair of reading glasses lay folded over a church bulletin. A dish towel still hung over the sink, carefully spread as if Miriam had meant to return in just a minute. Yet the stillness in the room had been broken in specific places. A drawer near the sideboard stood open 3 inches. The back door had splintered wood around the latch. A small framed photograph on the counter had been set down crooked after being lifted and replaced. These were not the marks of a thief looking for cash. They were the marks of someone searching with purpose. Evelyn moved slowly, letting the room speak in its own order. She found a take-out receipt tucked beneath a sugar jar, time-stamped the previous evening. She found a notepad with several times written in blue ink, then circled again in red. 5:05, 5:12, 5:28. On another page, Miriam had written the local pharmacy's closing hour and the drive time from town in a hand that pressed harder the farther down the page it went. Ben leaned in and frowned. She was timing something. Evelyn nodded. Or someone was timing her. That distinction mattered. She had seen enough staged chaos in her life to know that some criminals did not rush. Some of them watched. They learned your habits. They counted minutes the way careful women count teaspoons in a family recipe. That was what chilled her most. Whoever had come here had not kicked the world over in anger. They had waited for a window. Mrs. Darlene Fitch, from the cabin across the lane, arrived 10 minutes later, wrapped in a quilted plum-colored coat and a knitted hat with a ridiculous pom-pom that trembled every time she breathed. She was in her late 60s, narrow as a cattail, with sharp cheeks, watery hazel eyes, and the nervous energy of a woman who had spent most of her life noticing everything because no one else bothered to. She apologized 3 times before speaking and then spoke without pause. Miriam, she said, had seemed uneasy all week. She had checked her mailbox twice yesterday, then once more after dark. Around late afternoon, Darlene had seen her standing by the kitchen window with the phone to her ear, one hand pressed flat against the table like she was steadying herself. "I couldn't hear much," Darlene admitted, lowering her voice as if the walls might take offense. "But I heard her ask about how long it takes from town if traffic's light. Then she said, 'No, not on the phone, just come.'" Darlene looked at Evelyn with the solemn misery of small-town witnesses, people who hate bringing bad news because it feels like betrayal, even when truth is all they have left. She wasn't confused. She was scared. A sudden burst of white light flashed across the kitchen when the sun struck the lake and bounced through the window, blinding the room for one breathless second. And in that bright silence, Evelyn felt the shape of the trap before she fully understood it. When her vision settled, Ranger had moved to a narrow cabinet near the refrigerator. He pawed once, then again, and gave a low sound deep in his throat. Evelyn opened it. Inside were pill bottles, neatly arranged in rows, some current, some old, and beneath them a file box packed with folders secured by rubber bands gone brittle with age. She lifted the first folder and found the name, Elena Vale. The paper inside carried the stale official smell of records copied too many times. Dates, prescription changes, telehealth appointments, medication adjustments happening within days of each other, typed summaries that sounded polished and incomplete at the same time. Miriam's handwriting ran in the margins, thin and angry in places, tender in others. Too fast. She said it made her worse. No blood work. Not sleeping. Evelyn read just enough to understand the outline and then forced herself to stop. This was not yet a medical case. This was a kidnapping, an assault, a missing woman, and a home that had been searched for something worth hurting people over. Ben, meanwhile, was photographing the broken latch at the back door. "Look at this," he said. The splintering was clean, close to the strike plate, not amateur force, controlled, fast. Evelyn crossed to the small dining table and crouched when she noticed scrape marks along the underside. Taped there, hidden from ordinary sight, had been a shallow envelope or pouch. The tape remained, but whatever had been secured, there was gone. Someone had known where to look or had searched long enough to think like the woman they were hunting. Evelyn felt a sharp private surge of anger. Miriam had tried to hide something in the oldest human place possible, under the table where people eat and pray and worry about bills, and still they had reached under and taken it. Then she saw the paper tucked against one table leg, folded into a tiny square, no bigger than a matchbook. She opened it carefully. The handwriting was shaky, but the message was plain. Don't trust the one who sounds too kind. Evelyn read it twice. The room around her seemed to change shape. This was not fear of some loud, obvious brute. This was fear of a civilized voice, a polished man, someone who could smile at a grieving mother and call it care while stripping the truth down to bones. She slipped the note into an evidence sleeve and stood very still. Outside, the lake shone like innocence. Inside, the cabin held the soft remains of a woman's ordinary life and the first hard edges of something much larger. Miriam Vale had not been waiting for rescue. She had been preparing for a reckoning. Evelyn looked toward the window, where the light lay cold and beautiful across the yard, and understood that whoever had taken Miriam had not come merely to frighten her. They had come to recover something. And somewhere behind all this, hidden beneath politeness and paperwork, was a person Miriam had learned to fear more than any man who broke doors in the dark. Caleb Mercer woke the second time to the soft mechanical rhythm of the hospital room and the pale afternoon light spilling across the wall in a square so still it almost looked painted there. White Pine Regional was not a large hospital, and there was something honest about that. The room held only what it had to hold: a narrow bed, a metal chair, a small monitor blinking with indifferent loyalty, and a window that looked out toward the distant line of pines. Caleb lay against the pillows with one side of his face yellowing into bruise, a strip of gauze at his hairline, and his right wrist wrapped where the nylon cord had bitten deepest. Even hurt, he looked like a young man built for endurance. At 25, he had the hard, clean strength of someone who had asked much of his body and expected it to answer. His shoulders were broad, his chest lean, his hands scarred in the ordinary American way of men who trained hard, lifted heavy things, and fixed their own mistakes. But the injury had peeled something rawer to the surface. Under the bruises, under the stubborn jaw, and the self-control, there was the old expression of a boy who had learned too early that safety was always temporary. Evelyn Shaw sat in the chair beside the bed with a yellow legal pad resting on one knee. She had taken off her suit jacket and rolled her sleeves once, enough to look human without losing the composed sharpness that seemed to travel with her. Ranger lay near the door, head on his paws, not asleep, but close enough to it that only Evelyn would have noticed the watchfulness hidden beneath the stillness. The German shepherd's ears twitched at every footstep in the hall. His large sable body rose and fell with calm breath, but his amber eyes kept returning to Caleb as if measuring the young man's pain against something older and harder to name. Deputy Ben Holloway stood by the window with a paper cup of coffee going cold in his hand. He looked too large for the room, all northern shoulders and patient silence, like a barn door trying very hard to be gentle. At first Caleb could give them only fragments. Miriam called, said, "Come alone," said, "Not on the phone," said, "Hurry." His voice kept catching on the edges of memory like fabric on a nail. Evelyn didn't push. She had learned that broken recollections often arrived like weather, first wind, then rain, then the truth you could no longer pretend not to see. So she let him rest, and when the doctor cleared him a few hours later, she came back with the same legal pad, the same careful eyes, and a little more quiet in the room. This time Caleb was stronger, tired, hurting, but stronger. "She used the old phrase," he said, staring toward the ceiling instead of at Evelyn, "the one she always used when I was younger." His mouth tightened, embarrassed by feeling. "If anyone asks, just say you're my grandson." He let out a breath that almost became a laugh and then didn't. "First time she said it, I was 16. Got into a fight behind a gas station. Not even a good reason. Some kid mouthed off, I mouthed back. Next thing I know, I've got blood on my shirt and a deputy asking where my people are." Ben shifted slightly at the word deputy, but didn't interrupt. "Miriam showed up," Caleb went on. "Tiny little woman in snow boots and a red scarf, white hair all over the place. She looked at that deputy like he'd personally disappointed the Lord and said, 'He's my grandson, and he's coming home with me.'" His bruised face softened at the memory. "She didn't even ask if I deserved saving." He told it slowly after that, and the shape of his life began to emerge. His mother had died when he was young. His father was a blank space he had long ago stopped trying to color in. Foster homes had followed, some decent, some careless, some mean, in the bored, tired way adults can be when they mistake a child's fear for trouble. Caleb had grown up learning how not to unpack his bag all the way. Then came Miriam Vale, who hired him first because he needed the cash and she needed snow cleared off her porch. Miriam had fed him chili in winter and sandwiches in summer, had paid him fairly, and had the strange old-fashioned habit of asking if he'd eaten breakfast, as if the answer mattered. She let him fix a loose fence post, then a gutter, then the back steps, and somewhere in all those small repairs she had built a place for him without making a speech about it. "There was always a chair for me," he said quietly. "At her table. Didn't matter if I showed up angry, late, muddy, whatever. There was always a chair." Down the hallway, a metal tray hit the floor with a sudden violent crash, and the sound split the room open for one sharp second. Ranger's head snapped up, Caleb flinched against the pillow, and then silence rushed back in, heavier than before. Evelyn waited until Caleb's breathing steadied. "Tell me about last night," she said. He shut his eyes. "She called just after dark, didn't explain. She never would if she thought someone might be listening." He swallowed. "Just said, 'Come now, use the back road, and Caleb, if anything goes wrong, remember who you are in this house.'" His hand moved weakly against the blanket, as though reaching for the meaning he had missed too late. "I got near the cabin, didn't even make it to the steps. Somebody came from the trees on my left. I hit him, hard. Then another one came low. There were at least 3, maybe 4. Evelyn watched his face, not just listening to what he said, but how. This was no performance. His body remembered in the same places, his mouth hesitated. One of them kept asking where the bag was, kept saying, "What did she hand you? Where's the rest?" They thought I had it already. He opened his eyes then, and anger returned full force, clean and bright despite the pain. "I didn't. She never got the chance." Ben set down his coffee. "Did they say anything else?" Caleb frowned, searching through the headache. One guy smelled like machine oil. Another one had something cleaner on him. Hospital clean almost. Like sanitizer and cold metal. Ranger lifted his head at that, as if the memory itself had entered the room. Evelyn made a note. Not woods drunks, not random local punks. Men who used gloves, tools, vehicles, routines. Men who worked for someone. "And one of them," Caleb said, slower now, "one of them told the others not to kill me there." His voice dropped. "Said, 'The old woman still has the original.'" The sentence settled into the room with dreadful clarity. Evelyn's eyes lifted from the page. If Miriam still had the original, then the search at the cabin had not been complete. The envelope under the table had been only one part. Miriam, careful Miriam with her flower pots and tea towels and church bulletins, had not trusted one hiding place. She had divided the truth the way frightened but determined people divide medicine in a storm, small portions, different cabinets, just in case one hand shakes. Later, back at the cabin, Evelyn opened Elena Vale's old file box again under the thin kitchen light. Ranger paced once, then sat near the table as if guarding both her and the dead girl's paper ghost. She turned one folder over and stopped. On the back cover, written in Miriam's tight blue script, and then crossed out again and again until the ink nearly tore the page, was a name. Dr. Adrian Kessler. Not a neighbor, not a thug. A polished name, a practiced name. The sort of name that belonged on brochures, conferences, and reassuring phone calls. Evelyn stared at it for a long moment, feeling the case shift beneath her feet. Caleb's beating in the woods had not been the whole crime. It had only been the rough hand reaching out from something far more careful and far more dangerous, hidden behind polite voices and clean offices. By the next morning, the case had begun to split into 2 different kinds of darkness. One was the kind Evelyn Shaw understood in a clean, procedural way. Assault, abduction, witness intimidation, unlawful confinement. The other lived farther back, behind folders and names and institutions that smiled while people bled. She stood in the sheriff's operations room at White Pine County Justice Center with Elena Vale's file spread across a scarred oak table, feeling that second darkness gather shape. The room itself was plain and practical, all fluorescent lights, humming vents, and bulletin boards pinned with maps, phone logs, and photographs. Sheriff Thomas Weller stood at the far end of the table, reading over a printout with both hands braced against the wood. He was a man in his early 60s, tall and square, with a sun-browned neck, iron-gray hair cut close over a deeply lined face, and the thick wrists of someone who had spent his younger years doing physical work before the badge ever found him. Weller had the old sheriff quality of seeming slow until the moment he was not. Years ago he had lost a deputy in a domestic call gone wrong, and since then caution had settled into him like an extra bone. He did not trust urgency unless it came with evidence. Evelyn liked him for that, even when it made things harder. Across from him sat Assistant U.S. Attorney Naomi Price, who had driven up from Duluth before dawn after Evelyn pushed the federal angle hard enough to be heard. Naomi was in her 40s, slim and sharply put together, with deep brown skin, short natural curls, and a face too intelligent to hide behind politeness for long. Her navy coat was folded neatly over the back of her chair, and a gold ring flashed on her hand every time she turned a page. She carried herself like a woman used to standing inside rooms full of men who mistook softness of voice for softness of mind. Naomi listened without interrupting, and when she finally spoke, she did so with the clipped precision of a person who had spent years turning messy suffering into arguments the law was forced to acknowledge. "You keep the active case narrow," she told Evelyn. "Kidnapping, assault, missing person, witness intimidation. That's what you can move on right now. The medical records and professional liability angle, I'll start the process with the right unit. Don't marry your theory too early." Evelyn nodded. She had no desire to chase ghosts when a living woman was still missing. Ranger lay near the door again, but this morning even his stillness felt alert. Every time someone entered the room, his ears rose before his head did. Caleb, against all good sense and medical advice, had insisted on coming downstairs from the county clinic annex for 10 minutes so he could hear any update directly. He stood leaning against the wall, pale beneath the bruises, one hand tucked protectively near his ribs. His sweatshirt hung loose over bandaged wrists and taped ribs, but it could not hide the restless strength in him. Pain had made him quieter, not smaller. His face remained battered, yet his eyes kept returning to the photographs of Miriam, as if looking away might count as betrayal. Evelyn laid out what they knew. Miriam had not vanished voluntarily. The men who took Caleb had believed he was the courier for some portion of the evidence. The hidden compartment under the table in Miriam's cabin had been emptied, but not completely enough to calm them. Elena's records pointed toward a long pattern of treatment decisions that Miriam herself had questioned. And at the center of those notes was one name, written and crossed out so many times it had nearly torn the paper. Dr. Adrian Kessler. Sheriff Weller lifted a brow. "That Kessler?" Naomi answered before Evelyn could. "The one who sits on advisory boards, talks about maternal crisis response, does television interviews in a cardigan and a careful voice? Yes. That Kessler." She slid a printed biography across the table. The photograph showed a man in his mid-50s with silver at the temples, neat dark eyebrows, and a face arranged into the kind of calm that comforts strangers on purpose. Adrian Kessler was handsome in a narrow, polished way. His jaw was fine rather than rugged, his hands clean, his smile modest enough to appear trustworthy. Men like that were often more dangerous than loud ones. Loud men announced themselves. Men like Kessler got invited into grief. "He doesn't break doors," Evelyn said quietly. "He hires people who know how." That was how the structure began to clarify. Kessler was not a thug in a suit. He was something colder, a mind insulated by status. The physical work, the surveillance, the pressure campaigns, the ugly errands, those likely passed through a private risk management company contracted to contain exposure in high-liability cases. Naomi had seen the type before. They called themselves consultants, crisis specialists, reputation advisors. Their brochures used words like stability and transition. Their invoices used words like retrieval and mitigation. A handful of local men could be bought to watch roads, leak schedules, or keep track of who was asking questions. The violence in the woods had likely not come from Kessler's hand, but from the long shadow of his interests. Evelyn returned to Miriam's timeline. Something had changed in the days before the abduction. She found it buried in a stack of printed emails recovered from the cabin printer tray. Elena's old account, supposedly dormant, had registered a login attempt from an unfamiliar device 3 nights earlier. 1 hour after that, according to a note in Miriam's hand, a duplicate packet she had left with a retired legal clerk in Brainerd could no longer be found. The retired clerk, a man named Walter Bean, had abruptly called to say he wanted no further involvement. He had sounded frightened enough that Miriam wrote the word twice and underlined it. That was the trigger. Not memory, not old paranoia, a fresh reach into buried things. Somebody had finally traced the trail back to her. Ranger surged to his feet with a guttural bark just as the doorknob turned, and the harsh metallic click of it made the whole room jolt. For 1 taut second, every hand froze, every breath held, and even the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz louder in the silence. The man at the door flinched backward so fast he nearly dropped his folder. He was young, thin, and harmless-looking, with pale skin and sandy hair falling into his eyes. A county records clerk named Owen Pritchard, according to the badge clipped crookedly to his belt. Owen was the kind of man people overlooked on purpose. Narrow shoulders, slouched posture, the exhausted face of someone who spent more time apologizing than living. His glasses were smudged, and his collar sat wrong, as if he'd dressed in a hurry and never recovered from it. "Sorry," he muttered, voice cracking. "I didn't know the dog was—" Ranger did not growl again, but he did not lie down either. He stood with his head low and eyes fixed. Evelyn watched the clerk carefully. Fear had a smell, so did guilt. It did not take long after that. Ben quietly checked outgoing call logs and access times for case documents. Owen had looked at files he had no reason to open. One call had gone to a prepaid number 37 minutes after the gas station footage had been uploaded into county records. Under questioning, the young clerk crumpled fast, not like a criminal mastermind, but like exactly what he was. An underpaid county employee with a gambling debt and a talent for making cowardice look temporary. He admitted passing small details to a local contractor in exchange for cash, never thinking it would become something like this. Evelyn felt a cold, familiar disgust. Evil did not always march in wearing boots. Sometimes it came in through a side door because a weak man wanted rent money and told himself no one would get hurt. Late that afternoon, the gas station manager sent over the cleaned footage from a highway station 15 miles south of the county line. The video was grainy, color-drained, and taken from an angle no decent filmmaker would ever choose. But it was enough. An SUV had pulled under the lights at 10:43 p.m. The rear passenger door opened. 2 men, faces obscured by caps and poor resolution, shifted someone in the back seat. Then, for one brief impossible moment, the woman inside turned toward the window. Miriam Vale. The image blurred at the edges, but her face was there, white hair loosened from its knot, cheek drawn, eyes wide and fixed, not on the men beside her, but outward, searching. Evelyn stopped the frame. Nobody spoke. In that smudged square of glass, Miriam did not look confused or defeated. She looked as if she understood perfectly well that time was running out, and had spent the last of her fear on trying to be seen. The road to the abandoned lakeside property narrowed until it was barely more than 2 pale tracks pressed through thawing earth and old pine needles. By late afternoon, the light had turned thin and metallic, that northern kind of brightness that made the world look clean even when it was not. Evelyn Shaw drove the last stretch in silence, her hands steady on the wheel, her eyes flicking between the road and the tree line as if danger might be thoughtful enough to announce itself. Ranger sat upright in the rear, motionless except for the slow turn of his head whenever the wind shifted. Beside him lay Caleb Mercer's folded map of the old resort grounds, marked from memory in pencil. The former sanatorium had once been called Lake Briar Retreat, a private recovery property for affluent patients who wanted quiet, discretion, and the illusion of healing surrounded by good scenery. Now it was mostly empty buildings, collapsing docks, and cabins sinking into the edge of the woods like forgotten teeth. Caleb had heard Miriam mention it twice over the years, always with a strange tightening in her voice, as if the place had once belonged to someone's lie. Caleb sat in the passenger seat with his seatbelt low across his bruised ribs, pale under the fading color of his injuries. He had changed into a dark flannel shirt borrowed from Ben Holloway, which hung broader in the shoulders and smelled faintly of detergent and cedar. The bruising along his face had settled into ugly yellow-purple shadows, and one hand remained wrapped at the wrist, but the deeper hurt in him had moved elsewhere. It was no longer only physical. It lived in the way he stared out the window too long, as if every stand of trees might hide the moment he had failed to reach Miriam in time. "The service lane comes up on the west side," he said quietly. "There used to be an old supply shed there. If they're using the main gate, the west side gets less attention." Evelyn kept driving. "You're here to guide and identify," she reminded him, "not to be brave." Caleb almost smiled, but the expression failed halfway. "I know the difference," he said. Evelyn wasn't sure he did. Most young men training toward war had a dangerous habit of confusing love with invincibility. Deputy Ben Holloway waited at the tree break with another county vehicle and one extra set of eyes. Marisol Vega, a paramedic from White Pine Regional, who had insisted on coming after hearing they might recover an elderly hostage. Marisol was in her early 30s, small and athletic, with dark olive skin, black hair braided tight beneath a knit cap, and the kind of still, competent face that made panicked people obey her before they realized they were doing it. She had the dry humor of someone who had seen enough blood to stop dramatizing it, and a scar just under her chin from a rollover crash she survived as a teenager, an accident that had turned her toward emergency medicine with the stubbornness of a vow. "I'm staying back until you call it," she told Evelyn, pulling gloves over narrow hands. "But if she's alive, I want to be close." Evelyn nodded once. No speeches, no wasted motion. They moved in on foot. The old property emerged in pieces through the trees. A main lodge with boarded windows, 3 detached cabins, a maintenance shack, and beyond them the lake itself, gray-blue and half-rimmed in brittle spring ice. The air carried the smell of damp wood, engine residue, and something sharper, cleaner, disinfectant. Ranger caught it before anyone else did. His head lifted, nostrils flaring, body locking into that hard, elegant stillness that always made Evelyn's pulse drop and sharpen at the same time. She unclipped him to a longer lead. He drew left, not toward the main building, but toward a lower path choked with dead brush. "West side," Caleb whispered. "That used to be the delivery route." Evelyn looked back at him. "Stay with Ben." Caleb started to protest, then saw something in her face and swallowed it. They followed Ranger down the narrow route until he stopped abruptly at a sagging split-rail fence. One broken board had fresh transfer on it, dark thread, torn cloth, recent. Ben crouched beside it. "Somebody came through fast." Ranger pressed forward again, then veered around the maintenance shack instead of past it. A second later, Evelyn saw why. On the far side of the open path, half hidden behind stacked pallets, sat a man with a rifle across his knees. He had not seen them. The guard was thick through the neck and shoulders, shaved-headed, bundled in a brown work coat, too new for a place this dead. He looked like the kind of man who had long ago trained himself not to think beyond the next order. Evelyn signaled Ben, who circled wide and took him down hard and clean before the man got more than a grunt into the air. Ranger did not bark. He simply watched, already searching for the next danger. Somewhere inside the property, a woman slammed once against a metal surface, and the ringing clang shot through the cold air like a cracked church bell, so sudden and lonely that every living thing in the trees seemed to pause around it. Evelyn moved faster. The locked cabin stood closest to the lake, its windows painted over from the inside. Up close, the smell intensified: bleach, stale air, plastic tubing, old panic. Not a hospital, but an imitation of control. Ben handled the door with a pry tool from his kit. The lock gave with a harsh snap. Inside, the room was dim except for one standing lamp and the dull pulse of a portable equipment panel on a folding table. There were restraints on the bed frame, a cooler of medication, a dead laptop beside a router unit with a blinking external link. And in the far corner, wrapped in a blanket but tied at one wrist to a metal chair, sat Miriam Vale. She looked smaller than the woman Caleb had described, but not weaker. Her white hair had come loose fully now, soft and wild around a face gone paper pale with exhaustion. Her cheek was bruised. Her mouth trembled once when she saw Caleb appear in the doorway behind Ben. And then some old iron in her seemed to rise and hold her upright. "I told you not to come alone," she whispered, voice rough as winter bark. Caleb dropped to one knee beside her, despite the pain in his ribs. "Yeah," he said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable. "You did." Marisol was called in at once. She knelt by Miriam with practiced gentleness, checking pupils, pulse, skin temperature. While she worked, Evelyn scanned the room. Papers had been searched here, too, but in a different way, methodically, with equipment. On the table sat a rugged black storage device linked to the laptop. Its screen showed a countdown window she understood immediately. Remote wipe sequence pending. Someone had left the system prepared to destroy its own contents if recovery looked compromised. Evelyn disconnected the router at once and pulled the storage unit free. "Not yet," she murmured, more to herself than anyone. Miriam's breathing steadied enough for speech. She looked past Evelyn to the device in her hand and closed her eyes briefly. "Elena found patterns," she said. "Not just pain. Patterns. Appointments shortened, medications changed too fast, notes edited afterward, families blamed before the questions were even asked." Her voice thinned but did not fail. She thought if she kept copies, someone decent would eventually listen. Evelyn felt the weight of that word. Decent. In another room, from a phone abandoned on the folding table, a call suddenly connected to voicemail and then cut, only a man's smooth recorded voice, clipped and calm, instructing someone to secure all materials. Not Adrian Kessler in the flesh, but his temperature was in it, his shape. A noise split the cabin porch. One of the restrained guard's partners had doubled back. Caleb turned too soon, pain stealing half his speed, and the man lunged through the doorway with a short-barreled pistol half raised. Ranger moved before the thought finished forming in anyone else's mind. He hit the attacker high at the shoulder, driving him sideways into the doorframe so the shot cracked harmlessly into the ceiling. Ben was on the man a heartbeat later. Caleb, white-faced and breathing hard, braced himself against the wall, shaken less by danger than by how close it had come. Ranger returned at once to Caleb's side, panting once, then pressing his flank lightly against the younger man's leg as if to steady him back into the world. The storage device would not open. Password prompt. 2 failed attempts left before lockdown. Evelyn's jaw tightened. Miriam looked at the screen, then at Caleb. "What did I always tell you?" she asked faintly. "When the town asked too many questions?" Caleb stared, then suddenly laughed through tears and pain at once. "If anyone asks," he whispered, "just say you're my grandson." He typed it, not the whole sentence, but the shortened phrase Miriam used to write inside birthday cards and lunch notes. "My grandson home." The screen blinked, paused, then opened. Rows of files filled the display. Dates, medication logs, appointment transcripts, internal edits, archived correspondence, insurance routing, liability memos, not rumor, not grief-struck suspicion, structure, proof. Outside, the lake threw back the last hard light of the day. Evelyn stood in that cold brightness with the open screen in her hands and understood that from this moment on, the people behind Miriam's suffering were no longer afraid of whispers. They were afraid of evidence. 3 days after the rescue at Lake Briar Retreat, the snow at the edge of Alder Lake began to give way in thin, glittering sheets, as if winter itself had finally grown too tired to keep holding on. The world around White Pine Crossing looked brighter now, but Evelyn Shaw had learned enough to distrust brightness when it arrived too easily. Sunlight poured across the county conference room windows in long, clean bars, warming the edges of the stacked files spread across the table. Inside those files were years of pain arranged into neat columns: medication logs, appointment summaries, altered timestamps, internal correspondence, liability drafts, unsigned review notes, and the recovered storage records Miriam Vale had risked everything to protect. Evelyn stood at the head of the table with one hand resting lightly on a folder labeled Elena Vale, her face calm, though inside her something was still catching up to the weight of what they had found. Assistant U.S. Attorney Naomi Price sat opposite her, sleeves rolled, glasses low on her nose now, as she worked through the final comparison chart. Naomi looked even sharper when tired. Her dark eyes had lost none of their precision, and the clean lines of her face seemed carved by will more than rest. She had spent the last 48 hours doing what good prosecutors do when truth finally stops whispering and begins to speak in complete sentences. She had organized it. Sheriff Thomas Weller stood by the wall with his arms folded across his broad chest, silent and solid as an old oak beam. The room also held one new figure, Dr. Hannah Reese, a forensic psychiatric consultant called in to keep the investigation grounded. Hannah was in her early 50s, fair-skinned and silver-haired, wearing a charcoal sweater and a plain wedding band. She had kind eyes, but not soft ones. Years of reviewing cases where grief and diagnosis were too easily confused had taught her to speak carefully. Her presence mattered because Evelyn did not want this case turned into a shallow verdict against illness, or motherhood, or medication itself. Hannah read for a long time before finally saying, "This does not show a simple story. It shows fragmented oversight, abrupt medication changes, poor follow-up, records altered after the fact, and a systematic effort to frame the family as the primary source of instability before the damage was even understood." Naomi nodded once. That was the sentence they had needed. What emerged was not a dramatic single revelation, but something colder and more believable. Elena Vale had been suffering, yes. Her records showed that clearly, but they also showed a pattern that should never have been dismissed so lightly. Short remote appointments replacing meaningful review, medications stacked or switched too quickly, side effects minimized, crisis notes edited, and timelines cleaned up after bad outcomes. Internal memos from entities tied to Adrian Kessler's network revealed language meant to reduce exposure, not deepen care. There was no one line that said villain because life was not foolish enough to write that plainly. Instead, there were small evasions, polished phrases, and evidence of pressure applied where frightened families were least able to fight back. The risk management contractors had done the rough work afterward, recovering documents, watching witnesses, buying silence where they could. and terror where they needed to. Caleb Mercer came in near noon, moving more slowly than he liked, but more steadily than before. The bruises on his face had softened from violent purple to sickly yellow. His right wrist was still wrapped, and he favored one side when he sat, but his eyes looked less hunted now. He had showered, shaved, and borrowed a proper jacket from Ben Holloway, though it still sat a little wrong on his broad frame, as if his body had not yet decided whether it was safe to belong anywhere. Ranger entered beside him in the same calm, purposeful silence he had carried from the first chapter of this story. The 5-year-old German shepherd seemed to understand the room had changed. He did not search it for threats the same way. He only settled at Evelyn's side first, then drifted toward Caleb, finally lying where he could see both. A guardian, still, but no longer braced for impact every second. Naomi explained what would happen next in language plain enough to be merciful. The evidence would move through federal channels. The recovered records were already being authenticated. The county clerk who leaked information had signed a full statement. The men from the lake property were talking more now that the case had turned from rumor to documentation. Adrian Kessler had not yet been paraded into handcuffs before cameras, and perhaps he never would be in the theatrical way people like to imagine justice. Men like him preferred doorways without witnesses, but his distance would not save him forever. The documents tied him to knowledge, and knowledge once preserved had a way of becoming heavier than charm. Caleb listened without interrupting. Miriam, seated in a cushioned chair by the window with a blanket over her knees, watched Naomi the way old women watch storms from porches, not because they can stop them, but because they know exactly what it costs to survive one. Miriam looked fragile in daylight. Her skin was nearly translucent, and the bruise along one cheekbone had turned the faint green yellow of a fading bruise on winter fruit. But she was not diminished. Her white hair had been brushed back softly now, and though her hands trembled at times, her gaze remained clear. When Dr. Hannah Reese finished explaining the difference between suffering from illness and being failed by a system that claimed to protect you, Miriam let out a breath so slow it sounded like something leaving her bones. "That's all Elena wanted," she said. "Not excuses, just the truth in the proper order." Evelyn felt that sentence settle inside her. The truth in the proper order. How many lives had been shattered simply because powerful people had rearranged the sequence until blame looked convenient? Outside the window, a broad slab of lake ice broke loose with a crack like a rifle shot, and for one suspended instant, the whole room went still, as if the season itself had answered something none of them had yet dared say aloud. By late afternoon, Evelyn drove Miriam and Caleb back to the cabin by Alder Lake. Marisol had wanted Miriam observed overnight again, but Miriam had smiled that stubborn little smile of the old and battle-tested and said she would recover faster where the kettle knew her name. So they brought her home. The porch boards groaned softly underfoot. The rocking chair still waited. Someone from the church had left a casserole in a foil pan by the door, and Darlene Fitch had placed fresh tulips in a jar on the kitchen table, as if beauty itself might help hold the house together. The air smelled faintly of cedar, tea, and the strange holiness of ordinary things restored to their place. As evening softened toward gold, Caleb helped Miriam onto the porch and tucked a blanket over her knees with awkward tenderness, like a man still getting used to the right to care for someone openly. Evelyn stood by the railing a little apart, hands in her coat pockets, watching the lake glow. She had begun this case as a federal agent responding to a narrow threat. Somewhere along the way, the labels had become smaller than the people. She understood now that what had saved this story from disappearing was not only training or evidence, though both mattered. It was the stubborn refusal of one frightened old woman to let her daughter be rewritten. It was the loyalty of a battered young man who came when called. It was a dog who trusted fear before language. It was the simple decision not to look away. Miriam reached for Caleb's hand. He gave it to her immediately. For a moment she only held it, her weathered fingers wrapped around his scarred younger ones. Then she said, very softly, "You don't have to say that anymore for anyone to believe you." Caleb's eyes dropped. His throat moved once. Miriam squeezed his hand a little tighter and looked out over the lake. "This home was yours long before either of us said it out loud." That was all. No grand speech, no borrowed poetry. Just the kind of truth older Americans understand best. The kind spoken after work is done, after tears are too tired to be ashamed of themselves. Caleb bent forward and wept then, not loudly, not beautifully, just honestly. Evelyn did not move toward him. Some grief was not meant to be fixed. It was meant to be witnessed. Ranger lifted his head from the porch step, watching Caleb with those deep amber eyes, then lowered it again with a quiet sigh, as if the dog had known from the beginning that this, more than the chase or the rescue or the evidence, was what they had all been walking toward. The sun slid lower, the lake shone, and in that pale northern light, the truth at last had a home to stand in. In the end, this story reminds us that truth does not always arrive with noise, power, or applause. Sometimes it comes through the trembling courage of an old woman who refuses to let love be buried. Sometimes it comes through a wounded young man who still runs toward the people he calls family. And sometimes it comes through the silent loyalty of a dog who senses danger before the human heart is ready to name it. That is one of the quiet miracles of life. God often sends help in forms the world overlooks. There is a lesson here for all of us. Do not ignore the small cry for help. Do not assume that weakness means worthlessness. Do not believe that kindness is naive. Real strength is often gentle, real courage is often quiet, and real love is not only found in blood ties. Sometimes family is the person who keeps a chair for you at the table when the rest of the world keeps shutting doors. Sometimes healing begins the moment one soul decides not to walk away from another. This story also asks us to look at our daily lives with more compassion. In a world that moves too fast, where people are often judged by appearances, pain, or mistakes, we must remember to slow down and truly see each other. Be patient with the struggling, be tender with the elderly, protect the vulnerable, speak carefully, love generously, and never underestimate the goodness that can grow from one small act of faithfulness. And let us not forget the animals God places in our lives. Their love is pure, their loyalty is honest, and their hearts often reflect the kind of faithfulness we wish we saw more often in people. A dog may not speak our language, but sometimes it understands devotion, danger, and love better than we do. If you have an animal in your life, cherish it, protect it, love it well. Kindness toward animals is also a sign of the kind of heart we carry before God. Maybe that is the deepest message of all. Miracles do not always look like thunder from heaven. Sometimes they look like protection arriving at the last possible moment. Sometimes they look like truth surviving when evil tried to erase it. Sometimes they look like one more day, one more hand to hold, one more chance to choose love over fear. And in those moments, we are reminded that God is still present, still watching, still working through ordinary people, ordinary creatures, and ordinary acts of mercy. So as you leave this story, take its lesson into your own life. Call someone you love. Forgive where you can. Help where you are able. Feed the hungry, comfort the lonely, and be the kind of person whose kindness makes another human being feel safe. The world has enough coldness already. What it needs more of is steady love. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from and what part of this story stayed with you most. And if you believe stories of faith, courage, kindness, and the bond between people and animals still matter, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next journey. May God bless every person watching. May He protect your home, strengthen your heart, heal your hidden wounds, and surround you with peace. May He bless your family, your faithful animals, and every road you still have left to walk.